Welcome back to the deep dive. We take the sources you send us, we pull them apart, and hopefully put them back together so you walk away informed, maybe even a little bit shocked.
And today, we're definitely wading into some challenging waters.
Yeah, deeply traditional interpretations of biblical prophecy, but also, well, frankly, radical ones too. We're looking at sources that pretty much tear down a major pillar of Western end times thinking.
That's right. For centuries, the standard view, it's often placed the key end time players, the Antichrist, his empire, mystery Babylon somewhere in Europe, kind of revived Roman thing.
Revived Roman Empire theory, yeah. We hear that a lot.
Exactly. But the material we dug into for this, it suggests this really shocking identity swap. The argument is that the final act is thoroughly Middle Eastern, specifically Islamic.
Yeah.
And if these sources are right, well, it shifts almost everything.
Okay, let's unpack that mission then. Synthesize this argument. The biblical Antichrist and the Islamic Mahdi are the same figure, not just similar, but the same guy.
That's the core thesis. One and the same historical figure, just, recognized differently by two competing religious systems.
It's fascinating because these systems seem like mirror images, but they completely flip the roles of good and evil, don't they?
Perfectly put. The biblical Antichrist. He's this powerful political and religious leader, makes a 7-year deal with Israel, brings a false peace before showing his true colors.
Right, the ultimate deceiver.
Then you have the Mahdi in Islam. He's their awaited Messiah figure, often a descendant of Muhammad. Islamic traditions say he'll set up a global Islamic caliphate, lead military campaigns, jihad to make it happen.
But wait, the Antichrist is the man of lawlessness, pure evil. The Mahdi is Islam's righteous reformer. How? How did the sources bridge that gap? It seems like a massive contradiction.
Well, they argue it's only a surface contradiction. Look closer. Both figures, charismatic military and political leaders, both achieve global dominance. And crucially, both are linked to a 7-year political covenant.
A 7-year deal, both of them.
Yes. Islamic scholars often interpret this through the lens of the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, but applied globally. Now, the Antichrist looks righteous at first, right? Brings stability, then reveals his true nature halfway through the 7 years.
Okay.
The Mahdi's arrival, in tradition, immediately precedes a period of intense global conflict where he conquers the world. So the timing, the power, the 7-year covenant, the sources say the similarities are just too strong to ignore. They suggest the Antichrist is essentially stepping into the role Islam has already prepared for the Mahdi.
So the Antichrist fulfills the Mahdi's expected role, but from a biblical perspective, it's ultimate evil disguised as righteousness.
Precisely. It sets up this Antichrist Mahdi parallel.
Yeah.
But honestly, the part that really threw me, the most disruptive claim in these sources, it's about Jesus, the returning Jesus, according to Islamic tradition.
Yes. The figure we know is Jesus Christ. What do they say about him?
This is absolutely central. It shows the potential depth of the deception. Islamic tradition teaches that when Jesus, or Isa as they call him, returns, he won't come back as the Son of God Christians believe in.
No. Then how?
He comes back as a radical Muslim prophet.
Oh.
And his mission, it's not grace or redemption for Christians. The sources state his explicit purpose will be to abolish Christianity entirely.
Abolish it. So he'd have to, deny the core beliefs?
Exactly. He has to. Because the Quran itself vehemently denies those core Christian doctrines. It insists Jesus was just another prophet, maybe important, but not God in the flesh. Believing God has a son. The Quran calls that gross blasphemy, and it gets deeper. Islamic texts specifically deny Jesus died on the cross for sins. The claim it only was made to appear to them that way.
So the returning Muslim Jesus, in their tradition,
will deny his own divinity. Deny the crucifixion. He'll pledge allegiance to the Mahdi. He'll lead Israel's enemies against Israel. He'll break the cross, kill the swine symbols associated with Christianity and Judaism, and enforce Sharia, Muslim law. He basically acts as the Mahdi's top enforcer.
Wait a minute. Okay, hang on. If the Mahdi is the Antichrist, and this returning Jesus is the Mahdi's chief enforcer, then the figure the West expects to save them from the Antichrist is, in this Islamic tradition, effectively the Antichrist's right-hand man.
That's the terrifying conclusion the sources draw. It creates this incredibly deceptive scenario. Imagine, when the real Jesus returns, the King of Kings coming on the clouds, Islamic tradition might actually compel its followers to attack him.
Believing he's who?
Believing he's the Dajjal, Islam's false messiah, their version of the Antichrist. The deception isn't just accidental. The argument is it's built right into the end times framework of a major world religion, ready to welcome the real Antichrist as the Mahdi and fight the true Christ. mistaking him for the Dajjal.
That is heavy, really heavy, which leads us right into the context question. Why? Why has the Western Church for so long focused on Europe and kind of overlooked this Middle Eastern angle?
It really boils down to what the source material calls the problem of westernizing prophecy. It's just that's human nature, isn't it?
That's so.
Western believers, especially in secular democracies, tend to read their own world into the Bible. Their anxieties, their political landscape. For many in the West, the biggest enemy of faith feels abstract. Maybe atheistic humanism, secularism, globalism, moral relativism,
Things that seem to threaten their way of life or belief system.
Exactly. So they naturally assume the Antichrist must reflect that enemy. An atheistic humanist, maybe a slick European politician, a technocrat, because that's what mirrors their local spirit of the age.
We project our own battles onto these ancient texts written in a totally different world.
Perfectly said. And that brings us to rule number 2 of context. The Bible is fundamentally a Jerusalem-centric book. Israel, the Middle East, that's the stage.
Yeah.
The covenant, the prophets, the apostles, Jesus' birth, death, resurrection. It all happened right there.
In that specific geographical area.
Yes. Biblical prophecy tells a story centered on Jerusalem. Jesus is even prophesied to rule the entire earth from Jerusalem after he returns. So the sources argue, if the climax of history happens there, doesn't it make sense that the main antagonist would come from that same geographical and cultural context, not from, say, Brussels or Rome, hundreds of miles away?
Okay, but that runs right up against the traditional interpretation of Daniel 9.26. That's been the bedrock for the European Antichrist theory for ages.
It has. The verse mentions the people of the prince to come who will destroy the city and the sanctuary.
And since General Titus and the Roman legions destroyed Jerusalem and the temple in 70 AD,
the logic followed that the future Antichrist, the prince to come, must be Roman, or at least European, descended from those people. It seems logical, almost watertight on the surface.
Seems like it. So where's the crack in that logic, according to these sources?
The crack appears when you look very closely at who actually made up those Roman legions in 70 AD. Were they Italians? Citizens shipped over from Rome? The historical records, the eyewitness accounts tell a different story.
Okay, so what did the sources say about the makeup of Titus's army?
They point out that the main legions involved the 5th Macedonica, 10th Fretensis, 15th Apollinaris, 12th Fulminata were primarily drawn from the eastern Roman provinces, specifically Syria. They were overwhelmingly composed of what they call provincials, not Italians, not Western Europeans.
Provincials from the east. How solid is that information?
It comes from top-tier historical sources. Yeah. We have the Roman senator and historian Tacitus, and crucially, Josephus, the Jewish military leader who actually witnessed the siege and later wrote its history.
What did Tacitus say?
Tacitus specifically mentioned that Titus's forces included a strong contingent of Arabs who hated the Jews with the usual hatred of neighbors. They were right there alongside the legions.
Arabs fighting alongside the Romans? Against the Jews? That's significant.
It's critical. And Josephus gives even more detail. He lists huge numbers of auxiliary troops provided by local client kings around Judea. Forces from places like Cochin, Amosa. He even mentions 6,000 men sent by Malchus, the king of Arabia. These auxiliaries, these Middle Eastern troops, were the ones doing a lot of the actual fighting and destruction during the siege.
So we're talking Syrians, Arabs, other Middle Eastern groups, not necessarily the Roman legionaries we picture from movies.
Exactly. Modern military historians confirm this. The Roman army, especially out east, was heavily provincialized, and the estimated ratio is startling. Some sources suggest that for every one soldier from Western Europe in that final assault on Jerusalem, there might have been as many as 11 soldiers from the Middle East.
11 to 1, wow. So the destruction was largely carried out by Middle Eastern hands, even if under Roman command.
In human terms, yes. And this is where the interpretation of Daniel 9.26 shifts dramatically.
How so?
The argument is that the verse focuses on the people, in Hebrew, of the prince to come, not the empire, Rome. If it meant the empire, there are other Hebrew words it could have used. By specifying the people, and knowing those people were overwhelmingly Middle Eastern provincials and auxiliaries.
Then the verse points to a Middle Eastern origin for the future prince, the Antichrist, not necessarily Roman or European.
That's the pivotal reinterpretation. It argues the focus is on ethnic origin, the bloodline of the people who did the destroying, not the political entity ruling at the time. This seriously weakens that traditional Roman pillar and throws the spotlight right back onto the Middle East.
Okay, that challenges the origin of the Antichrist. Now, what about the empire itself? The Beast Empire in Daniel chapters 2 and 7. The traditional view holds that the fourth kingdom, the legs of iron, the terrifying fourth beast, is Rome, which needs to be revived somehow at the end.
Right. But that view runs into major problems, especially with geography and the sheer power Daniel attributes to this final beast.
What kind of power?
Daniel describes it as utterly terrifying, a crushing power. It devours, breaks in pieces, and stamps the residue with its feet. It's total domination. And crucially, this final kingdom has to succeed and dominate the entire territory held by the three previous empires.
Babylon, Medo-Persia, and Greece. All of it.
All of it. That's the implied scope. Now, Rome was certainly a crushing power in many ways.
They were good at conquering, yes.
Absolutely. Yeah. But did they conquer and dominate all the territory of Babylon, Medo-Persia, and Greece combined?
Did they?
The historical record says no. The sources really emphasize this. Even at its absolute peak under Emperor Trajan, the Roman Empire only controlled about 1/3 of the total landmass held by those previous three empires.
Only a third. That seems insufficient for the final ultimate beast.
Think about it. Babylon itself, the capital of the First Empire, was about 500 miles east of the Roman frontier for most of Rome's history. Rome never even reached some of the major Persian capitals. Geographically, it just doesn't fit the description of consuming everything that came before it.
That's a pretty significant geographical shortfall for the traditional theory. If a kingdom only grabs a fraction of the previous empire's lands, how can it be the final, all-consuming one Daniel describes?
According to these sources, it can't. The prophecy seems to require a kingdom that fully occupies that core prophetic stage. So the question becomes, which historical empire did meet both criteria? Which empire conquered all the territory of Babylon, Medo-Persia, and Greece, and also fits the description of crushing and stamping out previous cultures?
And the answer, according to these sources, points towards
the historical Islamic Caliphate.
That caliphate. From its beginnings after Muhammad up to the Ottomans.
Exactly. We're talking that vast sweep of history from the Rashidun Caliphate starting around 632 AD through the Umayyads, the Abbasids, right up to the Ottoman Empire's end in 1923. Geographically, it's a near-perfect match. The Islamic Empire conquered and dominated all the land holdings of Babylon, Medo-Persia, and Greece, and then some across North Africa into Spain up through Anatolia.
Okay, the geography fits, but what about the crushing and stamping the residue part? How does the caliphate match that description?
This is where the cultural aspect comes in. Unlike the Romans, who often assimilated conquered cultures, letting them keep their languages, like Greek in the East, the sources argue the Islamic Caliphate operated differently. It's presented as an Arab Islamic supremacist force. How? Through the systematic imposition of Arabic language in Islamic culture across the Middle East and North Africa. Think about the disappearance of ancient languages in Coptic Christianity in Egypt, the destruction of countless churches, shrines, synagogues. The argument is that this historical process literally stamped the residue of previous cultures under his feet, erasing them in a way Rome didn't typically do. This historical pattern, they argue, fits Daniel's description of devouring and stamping much better than Rome does.
So a different kind of crushing, not just military, but cultural and religious eradication too.
That's the argument. It presents a much closer fit to the violent, totalizing description in Daniel 7.
Now, if the Beast Empire is identified as a future revived caliphate, how does this affect the interpretation of Ezekiel 38 and 39? The Gog of Magog war. That's almost always taught in the West as a separate future war, probably involving Russia, right?
Almost universally, yes. But the sources we looked at argue very strongly that Gog of Magog is not a separate conflict with Russia. They see it as simply another description, maybe a more detailed regional snapshot of the same final invasion led by the Antichrist.
Why do they link it directly to the Antichrist's final campaign?
The context, they say, is undeniable. Look at how the prophecy ends in Ezekiel 39. Israel experiences national salvation, God gathers them back from the nations, and his physical presence is recognized. He says, I will make myself known in the midst of my people Israel. These are end-of-the-age events, coinciding with the return of Christ. This timing forces the Gog invasion into that final slot, meaning Gog has to be linked to or identical with the Antichrist figure.
Okay, so if it's not Russia, why the persistent Russia connection, and how does this geographical correlation method the sources use dismantle that?
The Russia idea comes mostly from linguistics, trying to link the Hebrew word Rosh in Ezekiel 38 with Russia. The sources criticize this as a weak method, sort of tracing ancient names across migrations thousands of years later, often ignoring the immediate context of Ezekiel's time.
So what's the alternative method?
It's simpler. Identify where these named peoples actually lived when Ezekiel was writing. Use contemporary geography and history.
All right, let's try that. Who are the main players in Ezekiel 38 according to this method?
You start with the leader, Gog. He's from the land of Magog, chief prince of Meshech and Tubal. Many scholars link Gog to a historical figure named Gages, who was the king of Lydia, and Lydia in Ezekiel's time.
Where was Lydia?
It covered the western half of modern-day Turkey. Then you have Magog, Meshech, and Tubal. These are consistently associated by historians and archaeologists with regions in Anatolia, which is, again, modern Turkey.
So the core leadership is Turkish, not Russian.
According to this geographical method, absolutely. Then look at the allies listed. Persia, that's clearly Iran. Kush, anciently referred to the region south of Egypt, modern Sudan, and possibly parts of the Horn of Africa, generally identified with Libya and possibly other parts of North Africa. Gomer and Togarmah are also often placed in Anatolia, Turkey.
So the coalition is Turkey, Iran, Sudan, Libya.
Exactly. It's a coalition of nations predominantly Islamic today, surrounding Israel from the north and south. It paints a picture of a regional Middle Eastern Islamic invasion, totally different from the traditional Russia-centric view, which relies on that shaky Rosh connection.
That forms a really coherent geographical picture then. If the Antichrist is Middle Eastern, his empire is a revived caliphate based in the Middle East, then the last piece of this prophetic puzzle, Mystery Babylon the Great, she must also fit this pattern, right? She can't suddenly be back in Europe.
Absolutely. The Great Harlot, described so vividly in Revelation 17 and 18, needs to be unmasked using the Bible's own criteria. And those criteria should align with this emerging Middle Eastern focus.
Okay, let's quickly run through those criteria again, because they're quite specific and a bit complex.
Right. First, she's a literal great city. But she also represents a larger entity, a kingdom, an economic sphere. It's that figure of speech, synecdoche, where the city stands for the whole system.
Got it. City and system. What else?
Second, she sits on many waters. Revelation itself interprets this for us in 17.15. It means peoples, multitudes, nations, and languages. So she's a center of global influence and population.
Okay. Third, this one always struck me as odd.
Yeah, the strange duality. She is located in a desert. The Greek word is eromos, meaning a desolate, lonely place. But at the same time, she must be a major port city. Revelation 18 talks about shipmasters and sailors weeping because no one buys her gomos, her cargo, her freight carried by ship anymore.
A desert port city. Seems contradictory.
It does on the surface. Fourth, she's described as a queen of incredible luxury, wealth, material excess, and maybe most importantly, fifth, she is drunk on the blood of the saints, the martyrs of Jesus, a center of intense religious persecution.
Okay, those are the clues. Before we get to the proposed answer, the sources must address the usual suspects, right? Rome, Babylon, maybe even the US.
They do, pretty quickly. Pagan Rome. Yes, it was the capital of the sixth beast empire in John's time, but the sources argue the satanic headquarters shifts to the capital of the final seventh-eighth empire, the Roman Catholic Church. Some Protestants point to the idolatry angle, but modern Rome isn't really the global political economic powerhouse described, nor the center of that kind of persecution today.
What about literal rebuilt Babylon in Iraq?
That fails on several counts. It's not currently a global superpower or the spiritual heart of a dominant world religion. Plus, if it were literally rebuilt Babylon, calling it a mystery seems, well, pointless. It wouldn't be mysterious at all.
Makes sense. And the idea popular in some American circles, New York City, maybe Washington, D.C.
The sources argue the U.S., despite its economic power and flaws, just doesn't fit the key religious and persecution criteria. It's not primarily known as the mother of harlots in the biblical sense of systemic idolatry, leading the world into false worship. And crucially, it's not drunk on the blood of the saints. While imperfect, the U.S. is still arguably the world's largest source of Christian missionary work and humanitarian aid, and a relative haven for religious freedom, which directly contradicts the harlot's description as the great persecutor.
Okay, so if those alternatives don't fit, where do the sources land? What's the candidate that fulfills all these criteria within that Middle Eastern framework?
The argument points squarely towards Mecca, and by extension, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, which surrounds and empowers it.
Mecca as Mystery Babylon. How does that fit? Let's start with the religious aspect, the mother of harlots, city of great idolatry.
Mecca is, without question, the spiritual epicenter of the entire Muslim world. Billions face it in prayer 5 times a day. Millions make the Hajj pilgrimage there. If you're looking for a city that represents the heart of a global, non-biblical religious system, a system the sources define as idolatrous, Mecca is arguably the prime candidate, the mother city of Islam.
And representing the larger system, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, with its immense wealth and influence.
Exactly. The city is the spiritual heart, the kingdom is the political and economic body. It fits the synecdoche. And it clearly sits on many waters, the peoples, multitudes, nations, and tongues of the global Islamic community, the Ummah.
Okay, but what about that weird geography? A city in the desert, Oromos, but also a port city profiting from sea trade, Gomos. Mecca is inland, isn't it?
It is. Mecca sits about 50 miles inland from the Red Sea, surrounded by harsh desert terrain. It perfectly fits the Oromos, the desolate location.
So where's the port?
Right down the road, Jeddah. For centuries, Jeddah has served as the primary port for Mecca. All the pilgrims, all the goods historically came through Jeddah. It's the necessary maritime gateway, the economic engine connected to the spiritual capital. Today, Jeddah is a massive commercial hub on the Red Sea, one of the world's busiest shipping lanes. And the Saudis are building colossal new ports nearby, like King Abdullah Economic City, KAES, explicitly designed to be global logistics and financial centers. So Mecca, the desert spiritual center, and Jeddah nearby ports, the maritime economic hub, function as one integrated system.
Ah, okay. The city and its essential nearby port functioning together. That reconciles the desert port paradox.
Precisely. Now let's talk idolatry. The sources aren't just talking about statues. Revelation uses harlotry metaphorically for spiritual unfaithfulness, false religion, often involving syncretism, mixing truth with paganism.
So what specific pagan elements do they point to within Islam centered at Mecca?
They detail how several core Islamic practices, particularly those centered around the Kaaba in Mecca, have pre-Islamic pagan origins. Things like the structure of the Hajj pilgrimage itself, the fasting month of Ramadan, and especially the ritual of tawaf circling the Kaaba 7 times. This circling mirrors ancient pagan processionals around idols or sacred stones.
And the Kaaba contains the black stone, right? What's the significance there?
The veneration of the black stone is highlighted as critically important. Pre-Islamic Arabia was steeped in worship of stones and astral deities. The black stone, embedded in the Kaaba, isn't just a historical marker. Islamic tradition, the Hadith, says that on Judgment Day, Allah will give the stone eyes and a tongue, and it will testify for everyone who touched or kissed it in faith.
Testify for them.
Yes. The sources present this as a form of idolatry, seeking favor or justification from an inanimate object, a practice rooted in pre-Islamic paganism, possibly linked to fertility goddesses. It's seen as a counterfeit to justification through Christ's sacrifice.
What about the symbols, the crescent moon and star we associate with Islam?
The sources point out that this symbol isn't originally Islamic. Muhammad didn't use it. It became widely adopted much later under the Ottomans. But the crescent moon itself was a major symbol for various ancient Middle Eastern pagan deities, often associated with moon gods or goddesses like Star Ishtar, sometimes war gods. They even cite the Old Testament, where Gideon takes crescent ornaments, Saranim, as spoils from the Ishmaelites, the desert dwellers, linking that symbol to ancient pagan worship in that very region.
Okay, so the argument is pagan roots, idolatrous practices centered on Mecca. Now the final criteria. Queen of luxury, seducing the kings of the earth, and drunk on the blood of saints. How does Saudi Arabia fit that?
The luxury part, that's almost undeniable, isn't it? The sheer, almost unimaginable wealth of the Saudi kingdom fueled by oil. We hear stories, gold-plated fixtures, palaces with hundreds of rooms, multi-billion-dollar vanity projects. It fits that queen of luxury description perfectly.
And this wealth is used to seduce or influence kings, world leaders.
That's the argument. The sources point to Saudi Arabia's massive global spending campaign. They cite figures like over $100 billion spent over 30 years exporting its specific, rigid brand of Islam, Wahhabism worldwide. Building mosques, funding schools, distributing literature. It's described as perhaps the largest, most well-funded religious propagation effort in history.
$100 billion. That's staggering. And that connects to influencing political leaders.
Yes, the idea is that this money buys influence, compliance, and silence. The sources provide the example of former U.S. President Jimmy Carter and his Carter Center receiving significant Saudi donations. They correlate this funding with Carter becoming an increasingly vocal critic of Israel, even causing some board members to resign over his rhetoric, citing his anti-Israel stance. This is presented as a case study of how the kingdom uses its wealth to sway prominent global figures, the kings of the earth, to its side or its agenda.
So putting it all together, Mecca as the spiritual heart in the desert, Jeddah as the port, pre-Islamic pagan roots in its practices, unparalleled luxury funded by oil, and using that wealth to globally promote its ideology and influence leaders.
And then there's the final, darkest criterion: drunk on the blood of the saints.
Which leads us to the ideology itself. What is the nature of this system that would fulfill the prophecies of intense end-time persecution?
The ideology, as presented in the sources based on classical Islamic texts, must inherently contain the justification and the means for the kind of persecution described in Revelation 13 and 20. The core argument is that traditional Islam has an explicit goal of eventual world domination.
Domination, meaning?
Meaning the ultimate establishment of Islamic rule, Sharia, globally, and the eradication or subjugation of all other religions. This isn't presented as a fringe view, but as a historical and theological goal enforced through jihad.
We need to be precise about jihad here. What definition are the sources using?
They are clear they're referencing classical Islamic law, not necessarily the actions or beliefs of all individual Muslims today. In that classical jurisprudence, they state jihad is an obligation on the Muslim community. And citing major commentators like Ibn Kathir, this includes offensive jihad fighting non-Muslims until they either convert to Islam or submit to Islamic rule and pay the jizya tax. It's framed as an ideological imperative for expansion and conquest.
And deception plays a role in this conquest. You mentioned al-taqiyya earlier.
Yes. Taqiyya traditionally refers to concealing one's faith when under direct threat or persecution. However, the sources go further, citing specific incidents from the Hadith and the Sirah, biographies of Muhammad. They reference accounts where Muhammad allegedly gave permission to his followers to use deception, even outright lying, to gain the trust of enemies in order to assassinate them.
Specific example.
They mention the killings of Ka'b bin al-Ashraf and Shahband ibn Khalid al-Hazli, where subterfuge and false assurances were reportedly used to get close enough for the kill. The sources present this not as isolated incidents, but as establishing a principle where deception is a permissible, even sanctioned, tool of warfare and ideological struggle against the perceived enemies of Islam. The implication is profound, that truth can be subordinated to the goal of victory.
Wow. Okay. And this system's persecution must have a particular focus, especially regarding Israel.
Absolutely. The sources stress that the animosity towards Jews in foundational Islamic texts is deep and ancient, predating the modern state of Israel by centuries. They cite specific Quranic verses, like the one about Allah transforming disobedient Sabbath breakers, often interpreted as Jews, into apes and swine. This language has been historically used to dehumanize Jewish people.
And the Hadith.
There's the infamous, widely known hadith predicting a future apocalyptic battle where Muslims will fight and kill Jews. In this tradition, the very stones and trees will cry out, "O Muslim, O servant of Allah, there is a Jew behind me, come and kill him." Except for one particular tree, the Garkad tree, sometimes called the Jews tree. The sources argue this deep-seated, religiously sanctioned anti-Semitism provides the necessary ideological fuel for the Antichrist's final campaign against Israel and Jerusalem.
And what about Christians? Or anyone who refuses the mark of the beast system? Revelation 20, verse 4 is chillingly specific about their fate.
It is. John says, "I saw the souls of those who had been beheaded for their witness to Jesus and for the word of God." Beheading. Not just killed, but specifically beheaded.
And the sources connect this directly to historical Islamic practice.
Yes, very directly. They argue that beheading has been a historically documented method of execution and asserting dominance within Islamic conquests and rule for centuries. They give stark examples, like the actions of Khalid ibn al-Walid, one of Muhammad's most famous generals, after the Battle of Ulays in 633 AD. He reportedly made a vow to Allah to make a nearby canal run red with the blood of Persian captives. Thousands were allegedly beheaded until the canal literally flowed with blood, earning it the name Blood Canal in some histories. Another example often cited is Muhammad's own reported order to behead the men of the Jewish tribe of Banu Qurayza in Medina after they surrendered.
These weren't just isolated acts of wartime brutality.
The argument is they established a precedent, a known method within that historical context, and hasn't entirely disappeared. The sources connect this historical practice to modern events, like the horrific case in 2014 in Oklahoma, where Alton Nolan, a convert to Islam, beheaded a female coworker after being fired. They see this not as random violence, but as a direct echo of that historical methodology prescribed for dealing with perceived enemies or infidels, linking the historical caliphate's methods to the specific form of martyrdom predicted in Revelation for those who oppose the final beast.
So the violence, the specific method of persecution like beheading, combined with the core theological rejection of Christ's divinity. This is what leads the sources to label the entire system as fundamentally antichrist.
Precisely. 1 John tells us the spirit of Antichrist denies that Jesus is the Christ, denies the Father and the Son. Since Islam's core theology explicitly denies Jesus is the Son of God, calls that belief gross blasphemy, and denies the crucifixion and its atoning power, the source material concludes that Islam, as a religious system, inherently embodies that Antichrist spirit. The final Antichrist figure, the Mahdi, doesn't invent this system. He rises out of it, personifies it, and leads it to its ultimate terrible conclusion.
Okay, that's a lot. A complete reconfiguration of the end times map, pulling the focus entirely away from Europe and centering it squarely on the Middle East within an Islamic context. So after absorbing all this massive shift, what's the takeaway for us, for the listener? If the Antichrist, the empire, the harlot city, the specific type of persecution, if it all aligns within this Middle Eastern Islamic framework, what are the practical implications?
Well, the sources suggest it brings a kind of clarity, resolving many long-standing tensions or geographical problems in prophecy interpretation. But the application isn't meant to be fear or prejudice. Quite the opposite.
How so?
It demands, first, confidence in the biblical narrative, but second, it calls for approaching Muslims not with hostility, but with compassion, with humility and love. Recognizing them as people created in God's image, but potentially caught within a system the Bible describes as deceptive.
Remembering that quote from the Sufi mystic Rumi that was in the sources, recognize the ocean in a drop, seeing the person beyond the system.
Beautifully put. That's exactly it. And practically, if you live in the West, this perspective means the mission field is no longer just over there, it's right here.
How do you mean?
Think about the numbers cited. Around 8 million Muslims estimated just in America. Millions more across Europe. This represents an enormous accessible opportunity for outreach, for building bridges, for sharing the Christian faith with understanding and respect. It requires engagement, not just geopolitical theorizing.
And sharing the full gospel message, which the sources argue includes more than just the initial point of salvation.
Absolutely. The cross is the non-negotiable foundation. Forgiveness of sins through Christ's sacrifice. But the sources emphasize the gospel's conclusion. The literal, physical return of Jesus Christ as King. The testimony of Jesus, Revelation says, is the spirit of prophecy. Understanding the end times, the return of Christ to reign from Jerusalem, that's part of the full hope, the complete message that offers perspective beyond the darkness of the current age.
Okay, that provides a path forward. Which brings us to our final provocative thought for you, the listener, to take away from this deep dive. If this interpretation holds weight, if the final Antichrist empire is indeed fueled by this specific kind of religious fervor originating in the Middle East, and if biblical prophecy indicates the Antichrist makes a 7-year treaty or covenant with Israel, only to break it and invade when Israel feels secure.
Daniel 9.27, Ezekiel 38, talking about Israel dwelling securely.
Great. Then what current events, what diplomatic maneuvers happening right now in the Middle East might we be overlooking? Especially moves aimed at achieving regional peace, normalization, economic integration, things that might seem positive on the surface, like the Abraham Accords or other normalization deals. Could these, viewed through the lens of these sources, potentially be laying the groundwork, creating the very conditions of perceived security and interconnectedness that prophecy says will precede that final betrayal, that covenant with death?
It's a question the sources compel us to ask, not to set dates or predict specifics, but simply to be alert, as commanded, to analyze world events, especially in that region, through the lens of biblical prophecy, not living in fear, but certainly living in informed anticipation of the King's return.
A really compelling and, for many, I imagine, a deeply challenging perspective. It certainly gives the source material we examine a powerful, unified voice. Thank you for joining us for the deep dive.